from Colorado.
Madam President, I rise on behalf of consumers in Colorado and across this country who work hard every day, pay their bills on time, and struggle to stay ahead in the midst of an economic recession. In the face of these challenges, the last thing Colorado families need are credit card companies that arbitrarily change terms and charge fees, offering only legalese in print so small, Madam President, you need a magnifying glass to read it. Some credit card companies have been taking advantage of consumers for years. This bipartisan bill would give cardholders some much-needed relief, and I'm very glad we're taking it up this week. And why, Madam President? Because after the near financial collapse last year, Congress has worked to meet the needs of banks and financial institutions. Well, I think it's time working families also had someone in their corner. This bill is about them. It's about making sure that families who pay their bills on time and stay within their means can't get charged excessive fees or see their interest rates jacked up without clear notice. And I've come to the floor, as many of my colleagues have today, to urge our other colleagues to support this important legislation. Now, Madam President, we know how important short-term credit is to families. And we've all heard stories of people who've been victimized by the kind of unfair dealing that I'm talking about tonight. And as a longtime supporter of credit card reform, I've met with countless victims of the abusive practices of credit card companies. One of them was a wonderful woman by the name of Susan Wands, and I want to take a minute to share her experience with you here tonight. I met Susan in person last year when she flew from Denver to Washington to testify before Congress about the unfair treatment she received from a credit card company. She has a classic story, Madam President. She's always maintained a high FICO score, never exceeded her card's limit, and always paid the amount required on time. In short, she's a good customer who plays by the rules and lives within her means. But despite Susan's good standing, one of her credit card issuers doubled her interest rate to 25% without notice. When she later asked why, she was told that the rate had been increased not because she'd missed a payment, but because this particular credit card company decided her balance on another card was too high. Madam President, this practice, known as universal default, will no longer be allowed if this legislation passes and is signed into law. Now, unfortunately for Susan, this kind of treatment didn't stop there. Just before she was prepared to testify in the House of Representatives, the powerful lobbying interest of the banks and credit card issuers insisted that she sign a waiver relinquishing her privacy rights to her personal financial information. And then a month later, after a deal was worked out to have Susan return to Washington and finally tell her story without fearing that her personal information would be released to the press, that information was released anyway. Now, while Susan had nothing to hide, the treatment she received is indicative of the abusive treatment American consumers have been subject to at the hands of credit card companies. This kind of treatment has to stop, and that's why, Madam President, we need this bill. The bill will put in place some common sense rules that will protect honest, hardworking Americans from unfair and downright abusive practices by credit card issuers. I first introduced similar legislation to protect individual consumers from this kind of unfair treatment by credit card companies back in 2006 as a member of the House of Representatives. I reintroduced that bill in the House in 2007. And last year I worked with Representative Carolyn Maloney from New York, to incorporate the principles of my bill in the Credit Card Holders Bill of Rights. I want to take a minute and thank and acknowledge Congresswoman Maloney for her hard work and her dedication in working on that legislation, which passed the House last year and then again just a few weeks ago. This year, one of my first steps as a freshman senator was to join with Senator Schumer in introducing the Credit Card Holders Bill of Rights here in the Senate. Now, the legislation we're considering here today overlaps in every critical category with the bill Senator Schumer and I introduced, and I did want to acknowledge Chairman Dodd for his leadership on this important issue. Madam President, here's what the bill does in short. It protects against arbitrary interest rate increases, number one. Number two, it prevents cardholders who pay on time from being unfairly penalized. Number three, it bars excessive fees, and it will require more fairness in the way payments are handled. And finally, it will prohibit the use of universal default clauses like I mentioned earlier in my remarks. Now, with all due respect, we know how important the credit card industry is to modern America. For many Americans, consumer credit is more than a convenience, it is a necessity. You have the parent who uses short-term credit to buy groceries, the small business owner who uses credit to cover expenses. And in that regard, a well-functioning credit card industry is absolutely essential to our economy. But this influence, Madam President, shouldn't give the credit card industry the right to abuse customers with an anything-goes in the name of profit approach. For far too long, the federal government has placed the blame for individuals' overbearing debts solely at the feet of the American consumer. Most notably, in 2005, the laws governing bankruptcy were fundamentally changed to prevent abuse. But while we passed laws to hold the American consumer accountable, too much emphasis was placed on borrowers alone. And just as Congress has cracked down on the predatory lending that spurred the subprime mortgage crisis, Congress must also do more to promote responsibility by the credit card companies that provide this important consumer credit. Madam President, the last several months, the federal government has taken extraordinary steps to respond to a financial crisis that's paralyzed the credit markets. This crisis was brought on, as we know all too well, by excessive leveraging and risk-taking on the part of the very banks that have treated credit card customers like Susan Ones so unfairly. I supported many of those steps to rescue the financial industry, as many in the Senate have done as well, despite my distaste for doing so, because I felt they were necessary to stabilize our economy and get credit flowing again. And it's now time we started working to level the playing field for American families who are being asked to pick up the tab. Madam President, as I close, I want to underline that this is a common sense bill whose time has come. It's time to stand up for working families again. This legislation is a big step in that direction. And again, I want to urge my colleagues to support it.